Hello readers and writers, I'm MJ and welcome to my December 2023 wrap-up. So there's so much content that I have to put out for wrapping up all of 2023 that by the time you are seeing this, we're probably at the end of January and just now getting to my December wrap-up. But I hope you've enjoyed all the best of videos that have come out preceding this, and now ready to hear what I actually read in December. December was a fairly good reading month for me, pretty average. I read 12 books in total, definitely down from the way too many I read last month in November to a more manageable amount. The books I read were mostly 300 to 499 pages. I did read one that was bigger than 500 pages, which I'm really happy about, and 3 that were under 300 pages. My nonfiction for this month was fantastic. I read 25% nonfiction, so I'm extremely happy about that, and 75% fiction. Fantasy was my most, the highest category I had, which seems to be the theme overall this year in 2023. My second highest category was LGBTQIA, which is great because it was the queer readathon. Even though I didn't end up reading as much during that week as I would have hoped, I did continue the books I was in the middle of. Well, one I'm still reading. And then a little too much YA, but there's a reason for that. Overall, 58% of the books I read are in print and 42% in audiobook, for a total of 2,505 pages, 53.3 hours. Now, my plan was the Queer Lit Readathon in December, as well as the Reindeer Readathon, the Reindeer Readathon, and then ended up doing something with my kid where basically it was a Read What You Own advent calendar where they wrapped up 16 books for me, and the idea is for them to be the next books that I read. So they completely picked the books out on their own, and then I read them. So I had very little control over my own TBR, but ended up being something really fun and really special with them that continued into the beginning of January. So to just it was fun because they kind of connected with my reading in a way that they usually don't, because they don't like books, especially to the extent that I do. So that made December really special. And it's also why a lot of these books are what I have read. I'm going to go ahead and start with, at the beginning, the first book that I read, and then go down to the book I read last. So the first book I picked up is After the Forest. This is a gorgeous Illumicrate edition. I was really looking forward to this one. I thought it was Hansel and Gretel retelling where they were witch hunters, and they were going to go reclaim their story, basically. What it really was a romantasy, which is fine if you like romantasies. I didn't enjoy the way it went, honestly. It was fine. It was an okay book, but it was not at all what I was expecting or hoping for. It did feel like good winter vibes, so that was great, but I was left feeling pretty disappointed. I do think a lot of people will really like this, my opinions will be in the minority, and I'm okay with that. I think if I had a better idea of what I was going into, as opposed to somehow me coming up with this vibe that I had going in, that I would have been less disappointed. I don't think I would have necessarily liked it more than I did. I didn't dislike it. I just wanted something else. Then I picked up They Called Me a Lioness, and I read this via audiobook from the library. I really enjoyed this book. It is a memoir of a Palestinian teenager and her like arrest and trial through military courts, and getting out, like the time she spent in prison and getting out. And it was a story that, like, I have been like collecting and reading all this like historical facts and fictions, but something about this memoir really kind of put things into context. So at the same time that I was reading this, Israel was releasing child prisoners, and doing it as an exchange for hostages, and it didn't really make sense to me, but then reading this book, it was like, oh, that's why they have so many children in prison. And so a lot of things kind of clicked into place because of reading this memoir. If you haven't picked it up, I do highly, highly recommend that you do. I will be continuing reading some additional books that have to help me understand better what's happening in this part of the world. And but this is one that connected me in a way I think some of the other nonfiction haven't done. Then I picked up The Basics of Spellcraft. If you've read my indie 23 and 23 indie wrap up, this was on there. It's a very complicated book for me to rate because it has fantastic ADHD rep and horrific autism rep in it. And so, like, I don't want to discount the ADHD rep, but at the same time, like, the more I think about the autism rep, the more offensive it becomes. So the ADHD rep, the main character is ADHD. My guess is that potentially the author is ADHD as well, although that is not confirmed at all. But definitely seems to have some personalized perspective. There is medication rep, where medications, for some reason the main character is getting medication at a very late age in life, and it's finally helping them to become more independent and break off from a parent more, which is very realistic for neurodiverse parents child interactions. And then the main character wants to go to this school, and the mother doesn't want to like let go of the final apron like strings. Now the mother's hit with a spell and gets put in a magical coma, and the main character goes off to the school in an attempt to learn enough magic to free her mother from this coma. I was really enjoying it until about halfway through, when there's this throwaway line about one of the friend groups having, like, the main character is questioning her own identity as being queer and being attracted to females, and there's this line by one of the other characters that I can't remember if they're like bi, but they're queer of some sort, and they say that one of their other friend groups is the token straight person, but this token straight person is also trans, and so we find out they're trans in the same sentence as we find out they're the token straight person, which I had a hard time with that sentence itself, because it's like almost seemed like it was not including transness in LGBTQIA rep, like, and so there's this horrific, like, there's an ongoing conversation about like gay and trans are separate, and so it did seem to be like almost saying, you know, trans is not part of us. And I don't hope it wasn't what it was trying to imply, but it really came across that way to me, and I had a hard time with that. And then there's nothing else that says this character is trans either. It just got sent in the sentence, which in some ways okay, but in other ways, like, you could have actually like done good trans rep. But then later we find out that this trans character is also autistic, and there's nothing about this character that says they're autistic at all. There's no autistic features. They're not built up enough as a character to be autistic. Oh, they're shy. That's it. They're shy. And then it says about autistic people, which it's giving their own label and then translated to the reader specifically to tell them that that means autistic. There are always lore keepers, which is so stereotypical. It was horrible. And then the only other autistic character is a teacher that the main character bonds well with, and it's very apparent the role that this teacher has very early on. And then there's just this throwaway comment about them being autistic. Again, we've interacted with this teacher more than the side friend group character, but there's nothing that would suggest they were autistic to me, not at all. And then we just have this throwaway line that they're also autistic. And I'm like, okay, well, obviously I'm wrong about where this character's headed, because that would be horrific if I am right. And I was right, and it was horrific. So the autism rep's really bad. Really, really bad. The ADHD rep, it's not as fleshed out just because like the medication management stops in the middle. But that's like a writing issue, I think, more than like a rep issue. And I really was relating more with the character with ADHD more than like these autistic characters that weren't developed at all. So I have very complicated feelings about this. Then I picked up Uniquely Human, and I had more complicated feelings about this book. So this is a nonfiction book I wanted to pick up because it's supposed to talk about the positive aspects of being autistic. And it does, in a way. It's written by a neurotypical author who started studying autism in the 70s, which is a very different viewpoint of autism, because individuals such as myself would not have been diagnosed then. I was diagnosed when I was 23, which is still pretty early, because it was still like the early 2000s at that point. And so I still had a fairly early diagnosis given everything, but they're like as early as at least 6th grade, we knew that there was something different about me. Our teachers knew, and before then, there's so many other dynamics that, anyways, going back on track. So this book is talking to caregivers of autistic children, and it set a tone off really fast in the intro, saying how he was going to talk about autistic people, and saying that autistic adults tend to use identity first language. So autistic adults is identity first. Being autistic is part of who you are, just like you would not say a person who is non-binary, you'd say non-binary person, or a person who is female, you would say a woman. The greater majority, not exclusively, but the greater majority of autistic adults, we prefer identity first language, because being autistic is as much as who I am as my gender identity and any other aspect of myself. And so he acknowledged that, he explained that, and then he said, well, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to use person first language. And that was the first thing that was like, oh, that's where we're going with this. He also said in that same intro that there were only 3 autistic adults. He didn't say autistic adults, of course, but I'm not using his language. There are only 3 autistic adults that were verbal enough to explain what it was like to be autistic. This book was written in 2004, and I call BS. That means he didn't even go out of his way to talk to autistic adults. He used the most convenient ones that he thought he could identify. So he expected the autistic person to come to him and relate to him what it was like to be autistic. Then he proceeds to at least the next half of the book talking about children, and their autistic experience always came back to him and related to him. So he's interpreting them, but it's more about him than it was even about the kids. And then we start getting some adult perspective in here, and he just, as much as he brings it in, he discounts it and said, like, hey, neurotypical parents, like, diagnosis. I and a lot of other autistic adults highly suggest that you tell your autistic kid their diagnosis, because it's not seen the same way as neurotypicals. Neurotypicals think, oh, they're going to get othered, ostracized, excluded. They'll use it as an excuse. All these other things that make no sense to me, because it's a framework of seeing the world. Like, I couldn't, until I had my autistic diagnosis, I couldn't function. Like, it was like knowing my place in the world, and that autism showed me, like, had me processing the world differently, was important for me then going back to school, going back to college, being able to mask enough to function. So I highly recommend that autistic children are told they're autistic and framed that way. And neurotypical parents don't typically agree with that. But their kids are autistic, so like, wouldn't you be using our frame as opposed to your frame of reference? But he acknowledges, again, the autistic adults tend to think that telling them about diagnosis is good, but then says, hey, neurotypical parents, do it your way. And that's pretty much what this book is. It was so offensive. So offensive. So there's a lot of that. Also, it doesn't, like, even though we acknowledge that parents can be autistic and have autistic children, like, it doesn't talk like the parents of autistic children could be autistic themselves or caregivers. So that also was offensive. But then this book is one of the few books that talks about meeting autistic people where we are, engaging in special interests, that stimming isn't bad, that they're, like, it doesn't say, like, the positive aspects of being autistic, because I firmly believe I'm successful at what I do because of my autism, not despite of it. And it doesn't go that far, but it does say that autistic people should be allowed to be autistic, which is just not as common a frame as it should be. So in that regards, it's positive, but at the same time, extremely offensive. So very mixed feelings about this book also, but a lot of feelings about it. Then I finished You Exist Too Much. I started this book in the Queer Lit Readathon as an audiobook. Didn't finish until the Queer Lit Readathon ended. I'm really glad I picked it up, even though it's not a book I would typically read. It's written by a Palestinian-American author, framed as the main character of a Palestinian-American who is queer and is struggling with a lot of self-identity, has an eating disorder that received treatment for previously, and then is going in the book in treatment for a love addiction. And there's a lot of self-work in this novel, which is complicated. It's a very complicated novel, a very complicated main character, and that's exactly who it was supposed to be. This kind of resolution of her identity with her own culture, also, like, it within lots of ways, being queer, being American, being Palestinian, was a very unique perspective for me, and I'm really glad I picked up this book. I think it was very well written. It was one of those books that I think will make me expand who I am to understand, and that's important to read books like that. But it's one that even now, like, I get caught just thinking up. It's not like just this book that you like, oh, that was fun, and then you brush off. It's a book that definitely, makes you think about it and contemplate parts of it, but then also, again, that fiction is so important for the connections between what it's like to actually be Palestinian American. I think fiction and like own voice experience kind of puts the historical context of what I'm reading in perspective with, like, some real world experience, and I think that's also extremely important. Then I picked up I'm Not Your Chosen One. I thought this book was extremely fun. I plan on reading the second book. It has Vietnamese American rep in it, so talking about the dual identity there. Also, then the main character is bi, is not out to their parents, and so they kind of come to this other world where they are the chosen one, but they're not, like, playing by the rules that were established, and end up going on their own epic quest and collecting their own group of people who tend to be, like, the social misfits, a little bit more queer. At the beginning of the book, the main character was a little crushing on everybody, which was a lot. But thankfully that ended, and once that did, I think I felt more comfortable within the story when there was like a main focus. And then it just kind of came cute. It is adult-ish. I would say it's almost new age more than it is like big time adults, but it's not YA, and I do appreciate that. I think the main character is like 23-ish. So it's not older adult rep or even middle-aged rep, but it's still kind of like new age group. But yeah, it's a fun read, and I'm very interested to see where the story is going to go. Then I picked up Where Peace is Lost. This is a science fiction story about a woman who's hiding away on a planet. She has her own dark secrets and things that just by hiding away that will kind of make them all go away, but then that doesn't end up being the case. She has to come out in the open to help save the planet that has kind of brought her in, and then kind of gets outed and booted and has to go back into the real world. It is a queer normative novel, which honestly from the description I was not expecting, but really appreciated. I don't know, this was one of those ones that probably should have been on my best science fiction list, but there were so many really great ones that I had to narrow it down. It's really good science fiction. I highly recommend you pick it up. But it's only not on the list because I read so many great science fiction this year. But definitely check out Where Peace is Lost. This is an interesting book. Raymond Chandler, The Long Goodbye. I picked it up when I was on my birthday bookstore tour, thinking that it was a different author. Raymond Carver, I think, a short story novelist that I had read when I was a lot younger, probably too young to be reading his stories, and I was like, oh, I want to reconnect with him. Nope, I picked up an author who is 1950s murder mystery. It's not, I don't know, this is a famous one. It has a movie written off of it, and I didn't enjoy it at all. I'm like, I don't want to say at all. It just, it's so socially motivated, and none of the motivations made any sense to me at all. Like, I didn't get why he made the decisions he did, and why people did what they did, and how, like, I had the murder solved so early. I was like, obviously I'm missing something. I was not. It just made it more complicated, and then I don't understand why he did what he did unless he's a horrible person. Like, I didn't get it. It's not, I don't know. I'm sure somebody else could get it and then they'd like it, but me, didn't understand it at all. And then I picked up Grunkle. This is one, I don't know when I picked this up. If I picked this up in the bookstore or if I just, oh no, I think I got it from Barnes & Noble. It was on like buy one get one 50% off. And so I needed another book, so I picked this up, not realizing that it was the author of Lily and Octopus, which is a book that I detested. But I enjoyed Grunkle. I'm glad I did give it a chance. I mean, I picked it up because it was very popular. I liked the plot and I liked the story, even though it was still, like, it dealt a lot with trauma and death. So it's not like an easy story. But you still have that fun Grunkle vibes. So it's very interesting in that way. But I do not like the writing style of this author. He just randomly drops into other POVs, and that annoys me to no end. And, like, there's not even a warning in this book. Like, you're just going on, you have your main POV, which is this Grunkle, and then all of a sudden you're in someone else's POV, and then you're out of someone else's POV, and you're like, wait a minute, what just happened? And I hate that a lot. I think it's sloppy writing, but it happened so much it had to have been on purpose. So yeah, I mean, a fun story for what it is. I get why it's on, like, so many people enjoy it, but the writing I have a complicated relationship with. Witches Steeped in Gold is one that has been on my list forever. I actually got this from a book box that I do no longer support because they are transphobic, and have not made any sort of reparations for the transphobicness that they have done, even though everyone seems to have forgotten about it. But that's not anything on this book. I was really excited to pick this up because it is diverse, with a lot of black magical fantasy. It was okay. It was definitely more romantasy, where the romance picks in. Definitely, I would say, like, it follows a YA plot structure, but it's new age characters. I think it's classified as YA, but the characters seem to be older than YA, even though they're following into the trope of YA. But it does seem like if you're on death row, the last thing you're going to be so worried about is, like, romantic relationships. And again, maybe that's just me, but it just became more complicated than it needed to be, and not as well rounded, like, it wasn't as fleshed out as I would have hoped it would have been. So it was okay. I'm sure a lot of people really love it. In fact, I remember a lot of people really love it. But it's definitely not my vibe, and I would have wished it was a little bit more fleshed out. Then The Iron Raven. Okay, so this is the first book in a series, which I picked up when it came out, and then it's been sitting on my shelves for about 2 years. I didn't realize until about halfway through, I started becoming concerned that this wasn't the first book in the series. But then I was like, no, I checked the book itself, and it says it's #1, and so I kept reading. But so much of the story is back-telling, like info-dumping stuff that has already happened. So I finally went and researched it, and it is the first book in a series, but there's at least one other series, if not 2 other series, that predate it. So I wouldn't pick this up unless you've read those other series. But then if you've read those other series, you don't need half the information that's in this already short book. So it's complicated. I do like the main character is Puck. I really enjoyed that. We're told through the narration of Puck, which I thought would have been, the narrating itself would have been a little more funny or abstract but it was very serious tone, while Puck himself was not a serious character, so that was interesting. And it's first person, which made it even more that juxtaposition. Like, we can see the actions of Puck, and it's like what we would expect Puck to be. But then we see the internal dialogue of Puck, and it's very serious. So that was weird for me. So I liked it. I enjoyed it, but because it was so, like, I was missing so much already, and then this juxtaposition between the internal monologue versus expectations and outward appearance, it was very interesting. I think everything this author's written has been connected to this series, so I don't know if I'll pick anything else up by her. If she has written something else not connected to this series, I think I potentially would, but it seems like so much of the series has already been spoiled by reading this book that I don't really want to backtrack. Then I finished Bird Girl. I got this as an ARC from Chaldean Books. This is such an interesting... Okay, so this is a memoir by an environmentalist that is in the UK, who is British Bangladesh, I believe. And the author was 18 at the time of writing a memoir, which, that is 2 memoirs I've read this month by teenagers, which is weird. Because typically you wouldn't be writing a memoir when you're still a teenager. This, like the title says, is about a girl who really enjoys birds. It has a lot of talk about different birds, bird watching. I think by the end of the book, I mean, she's up to like 5,000 books. Thankfully, we don't have to know about all of them. This is a very interesting book because the main character has been to 7 continents and has done a lot of traveling, has done a lot of introspection for a teenager, and so you kind of get why this book exists, but at the same time, she's at the very start of her life and her career and going to college, and it seems like a weird time to be writing a memoir. It also It also did a lot with her mother's mental health, but so much of it was when she was younger and rightfully being sheltered from what was happening from her mother, that really the only way she's coming back and talking about it is through other people's experience or from other logs that they had, like records that had been taken. So to me that seems like it's less a conversation about mental health and more conversation about what it's like to be a child of an adult with a mental illness, which is valid, but it wasn't like, it's not sold that way. And so I would have liked it to be a redefined that way. I don't think anywhere in here does it say that this book is actually written by a teenager, which I think would have put it in better perspective. The writing is extremely mature, which I get that the main character has had a lot of experiences, journal blogging, writing for articles, and had a whole team behind her when she was creating the book. It was an interesting read. Unless you like birds, I would not recommend you go and pick it up. If you do like birds, then absolutely go read this. You'll probably love it. Maybe if you're into ecology, it'd be a good fit. But otherwise, it was an interesting read. I did DNF one book. One of the things with my kid with doing this, this 16 Days of Christmas, which I have not finished reading all of these books, and not all of these books were part of that, but the vast majority of them were. But one of the things was I wasn't going to DNF, I was going to go through and read them till the end, and this was the one exception that I got from them. It is a Rainbow Crate book. Had I realized what I was getting into, I would have skipped this month. I was very put off by the author letter, so I'm going to read it. It says, "Dear readers, Prince and Assassin is a story about love, tenderness, and murder. If you detest sad assassins with purple eyes, or if you despise Playboy princess turned protective suitors, you have my full permission to stop right here. Flip through the pages, admire the lovely special edition art, and place the book on your shelf as a gorgeous ornament. But if you're intrigued by sad assassins and Playboy princesses, or hurt comfort moonlit dances, and adorable arrogant magic tigers, you're in luck. I'm very thrilled to make your acquaintance. Let's take a journey together to the magical land of Selacy. All yours." The author, Tavia Lark. So when I first read this, I was like, that's interesting. Like, I've written a letter like that in the beginning of my book, but it says something more along the lines of, hey, I have a lot of transphobic and working through a lot of stuff. If that's going to trigger you, I totally understand. Like, no hard feelings. But this seems almost like a joke on that. And I don't know if it was meant to be, but when I read it, I was like, well, are there no trigger warnings in here at all? Because that's like, you should love my book, or like else, or you're dumb. I mean, and maybe it's not meant, but when I first read that, I was like, interesting. And then I go to the trigger warnings, the content warnings, and it's light dom subdynamics, explicit sex, violence, death, past child abuse, past custodial kidnapping, blood magic, assassination, and murder. Those are pretty tough trigger warnings. So to have such a light-hearted author letter, and then pretty explicit content warnings, I was really put off by that, but I wasn't going to DNF, so I plugged through and made it 4 pages. 4. So I was already very hesitant about reading this book, but then within 4 pages it contradicted itself. It had a plot hole, and it was too much. I went to my kid, I talked to him about it, they saw the contact warnings, and they were like, that was enough for them to be like, yeah, I wouldn't want to read that either. And I DNF'd this book after 4 pages. I would be very interested in your thoughts on that author letter. Am I, like, would that, if you read that and saw that, like, what would your take be on it? I think how I took it is valid. Like, my feelings are valid, but I know that it's not the only way to take it. So I don't want to exclude how I interpreted the letter and how it came across to me, but I am interested in how others would have approached that. And I know I have different trigger warnings, and I would have plugged through even the explicitness of the book if the 4 pages and I already had a plot hole. But yeah, I don't know. I'm interested in your thoughts. That is my December wrap up. I'm very happy with what I did this month, what I did with the year overall, and I'm very excited for what 2024 is going to bring. So, as always, keep reading, keep writing, and until next time.